Welcome to Unlocking Passion. Men Report. Let's begin with a new story. The bill lay in front of him on the table like a bad joke. But Stefan Kruger stared at the numbers and tried to understand how this was possible. He had drunk a few beers, maybe 3 or 4. The women had ordered their drinks. But surely, that did not add up to this amount. Converted, it was almost 1,000 euros for 45 minutes in a bar. The waiter stood beside him, polite but firm. The 3 women, who only a few minutes earlier had been laughing and joking, had suddenly gone silent, their faces expressionless. A large man was leaning by the door with his arms crossed, probably a bouncer, and he did not take his eyes off him. The music in the bar kept playing, but now it seemed quieter, more threatening. Stefan tried to protest. "That cannot be right," he said. "It had to be a mistake, an error." But the waiter showed him a piece of paper with his signature on it. He had signed, the man said. He had agreed. Now he had to pay. At that moment, Stefan understood that he had walked into a trap. Not a brutal trap, no violence, no open criminality, but something much more subtle, a perfectly orchestrated system in which he had lost control from the very beginning without noticing it. A system designed to take money from men like him, legally, efficiently, without leaving traces. He paid. What else was he supposed to do? The bouncer at the door, the cold looks, the isolation in a foreign country. He pulled out his credit card and entered his number, his hands trembling, his head empty. Only when he was outside on the street, in the humid night of Pattaya, did he begin to understand what had really happened. This is not a story about a massive fraud, not €1 million, not a stolen identity, not an epic drama. This is the story of a simple evening that went wrong, the story of a man who thought he had everything under control, and the story of a warning that every man should hear before he believes he is too smart to fall into the trap. If you like the stories I create, then please subscribe to my channel. Your support is crucial for the growth of this channel and helps me find time for these documentaries, despite my full-time job. Thank you for being here. Stefan Kruger was not a man who took big risks. Throughout his entire life, he had played it safe, worked hard, saved, planned. He came from a small town in North Rhine-Westphalia, a place where everyone knew everyone and honesty still meant something. His father had been a plumber, and so had his grandfather. Stefan had continued the tradition without ever asking whether there was another path. At 21, he completed his apprenticeship. At 26, he became a master craftsman. At 30, he founded his own business, a small company with 3 journeymen and 1 van. Nothing big but solid, reliable, profitable. People called Stefan when their heating broke down, when their pipes leaked, when they needed someone they could trust. His marriage to Petra had lasted 16 years. It was not a passionate romance, more a pragmatic partnership. She worked as an accountant, he as a tradesman, and together they built a life that functioned. They had no children, although they had tried. At some point, they stopped trying and settled into a togetherness that was more habit than love. The divorce came when he was 50, unexpectedly, and yet not unexpectedly. Petra had met someone, a colleague from her company. She was sorry, she said, but she no longer felt alive with him. Stefan did not understand what she meant, but he accepted it. What else was he supposed to do? He sold the business, not because he had to, but because he suddenly had no desire for it anymore. For 30 years, he had laid pipes and repaired heating systems, and suddenly all of it seemed meaningless to him. What was the point of working if there was no one to come home for? He sold it to a younger colleague who wanted to keep the name and take over the customers. Stefan received 420,000 euros for it after all deductions and taxes, a small fortune for a simple tradesman. He did not know what to do with the money. He had no big dreams, no unanswered longings. Then, a former customer told him about Thailand, about Pattaya, about a place where German retirees could live well for little money. Stefan listened and began to think about it. At 57, he flew to Thailand for the first time, only for 1 month, to try it out. He rented an apartment in Yom Tien, settled in, and began exploring life there. He liked the warmth, the low prices, the relaxed atmosphere. After 1 month, he extended for 3 months. After half a year, he knew that he would stay. Stefan was not a typical sex tourist, not one of those men who came to Thailand to buy what they could not get at home. He went to bars, that was true, but more for sociability than greed. He liked the bustle, the music, the people. He drank his beer, had conversations, went home. Simple, uncomplicated, or so he thought. On that evening, in March, 2.5 years after his arrival in Thailand, Stefan entered a bar in downtown Pattaya. Not one of the large, notorious establishments, but a smaller, kosher one. He sat down at the counter, ordered a beer, and watched the activity around him. It was an evening like 100 others before, until the woman sat down next to him. Her name was Kanchana, but everyone called her Nam. She was perhaps in her mid-20s, with a face that looked both young and tired at the same time. She wore a simple dress, nothing flashy, and sat beside Stefan's with a smile that was polite but not pushy, not like some of the other women who immediately sat on someone's lap or begged for drinks. At first, they talked about trivial things. Where he came from, how long he had been in Thailand, whether he liked it. Her German was rudimentary, his Thai non-existent, but they communicated in English, which both of them spoke reasonably well. Nam laughed at the right moments, asked interested questions, and seemed genuinely curious. Stefan liked her. She was not like the others, not so businesslike. She seemed real, human. When she asked whether he would buy her a drink, he naturally said yes. It was only polite. She ordered something that the waiter brought her, a colorful drink in a tall glass. Stefan thought nothing of it. They continued talking for almost an hour. Stefan told her about his life in Germany, about his work, about his divorce. Nam told him about her family in Isan, about her mother who was ill, about her dream of one day opening a small shop. They were stories Stefan had heard 100 times before, but this time she seemed different, more real. Then Nam made a suggestion that changed everything. She had a friend in another bar, she said, only a few streets away. A quieter bar, fewer tourists. Would he like to come along? They could continue talking there, maybe eat a snack. Stefan hesitated briefly. It was already late. He was actually tired and wanted to go home, but Nam looked at him with those large, hopeful eyes, and he could not say no. What could happen? Another bar, a few drinks, a bit of company. It was all harmless, wasn't it? They left the first bar together. Stefan paid his bill, 200 baht for 2 beers, nothing unusual. Outside, the night was warm and damp, the streets full of people and neon lights. Nam hooked her arm into his and led him through a labyrinth of alleys. Stefan quickly lost his orientation, but he trusted Nam. Why wouldn't he? The second bar was smaller than the first. Darker, more intimate. Few guests, muted music. Nam led him to a table in the corner and waved to a waitress. Within minutes, they were seated, and everything seemed fine. Stefan relaxed, took a sip of his new beer, and Nam smiled at him. Then the friend appeared. The friend was called Ploy. That was how Nam introduced her. She was a slightly older woman, perhaps 30, with a smile so wide that it almost seemed fake. She sat down on the other side of Stefan and hugged him in greeting as if they were old acquaintances. Stefan felt a little uncomfortable, but he did not want to be rude. Ploy was Nam's friend, so she had to be all right. The two women began talking in Thai, too fast for Stefan to understand even a single word. They laughed, giggled, and occasionally threw him a glance. Stefan smiled back, unsure what was going on. He drank his beer and waited for them to include him in the conversation again. Ploy ordered drinks without asking him. She simply called the waitress, said something in Thai, and minutes later 3 new glasses stood on the table. Colorful cocktails, elaborately decorated, with little umbrellas and fruit. Stefan looked at them, confused. Had he ordered them? He could not remember. Nam placed her hand on his. "It is all right," she said. "Just a small gift, to celebrate the evening." Stefan nodded, although he did not know what they were celebrating. He drank from his cocktail. It tasted sweet and strong, like too much alcohol and too little of anything else. Then the third woman came. She did not even introduce herself, simply sat down as if it were the most natural thing in the world. A young woman, barely over 20, with a face full of makeup and a dress that left little room for imagination. She laughed loudly, too loudly, and placed her hand on Stefan's thigh. Stefan felt increasingly uncomfortable, surrounded by 3 women who all seemed to want something from him, without him understanding what. The waitress came again and brought more drinks. Stefan tried to protest and said that he had had enough. He did not want anything more. But the women only laughed and said it was all right, that he should relax. Ploy filled his glass. The third woman stroked his arm. Nams smiled at him reassuringly, as if she wanted to say, "Everything is fine, trust me." And Stefan, because he was a polite man, because he did not want to offend anyone, because he found himself in a situation he could no longer control, let it happen. He drank, he laughed, he tried to enjoy the situation, but deep inside him, a small voice began to whisper that something was not right here, that this was not a harmless evening, that he had made a mistake. Time blurred. How long did they sit there? 30 minutes? An hour? Stefan lost all sense of it. The music seemed to grow louder, the women's faces to blur. He kept drinking because it was the easiest thing to do. He laughed because everyone was laughing. He felt as if he were in a dream, or perhaps a nightmare from which he could not wake up. Then suddenly the atmosphere changed. The women became silent, their smiles disappeared. The music became quieter, or perhaps Stefan only imagined it. A waitress came to the table and placed something in front of him. Stefan looked down and saw a bill. A long bill with numbers that made no sense. 38,600 baht. Stefan stared at the numbers and waited for someone to explain that it was a joke. 38,600 baht. That was about 1,000 euros for less than an hour in a bar. that could not be right. It was impossible. He looked at the women, searching for an explanation, but for a sign that everything was fine. But their faces had become expressionless, cold, as if they had put on masks. Nam, who only minutes earlier had smiled so warmly, looked away. Ploy examined her fingernails. The third woman stood up and disappeared toward the restroom. Stefan turned to the waitress. "This must be a mistake," he said in English. He had not ordered that much. A few beers, a few drinks, nothing more. The waitress shook her head. "No mistake," she said. "The bill is correct. 3 lady drinks per woman, 800 baht per drink. Plus cocktails, snacks, service. Everything is listed on the bill." Stefan looked at the list. It was in Thai. He did not understand a word, but the numbers were clear. 800 baht for 1 drink multiplied by 9 drinks. Added to that were extras he could not identify. The total at the end was undeniable. 38,600 baht. He tried to argue. He had not known that the drinks were that expensive. No one had told him the prices. He had not agreed to pay that much. But the waitress showed him a slip of paper, a small receipt with his signature on it. "You signed," she said. When the first drinks came, he had signed. That meant consent. Stefan vaguely remembered a piece of paper someone had placed in front of him, asking him to sign here. He had not asked questions. He had simply signed because it had to be quick. Because the women were waiting. Because he did not want to look cheap. Now he cursed that signature, that stupid piece of paper that bound him. He looked around the bar, searching for support, for other guests who might help, but the few people who were there deliberately looked away. At the door stood a large man with his arms crossed, a bouncer whose gaze never left Stefan. The message was clear: pay or have problems. The women stood up, one after another. No goodbye, no thank you, no smile anymore. They simply disappeared, as if Stefan were air. He was left alone at the table with a bill that exceeded his budget for an entire month. He paid. What else was he supposed to do? In a foreign country, in a bar full of strangers, with a bouncer watching him. He pulled out his credit card, entered the numbers, and waited for the confirmation. The waitress smiled professionally as she handed him the receipt. "Thank you," she said. "Have a nice evening." Stefan left the bar as if in a trance. Outside, the heat hit him, but he felt only cold. He walked through the streets of Pattaya without knowing where he was going. His legs carried him automatically. His head was empty. Only when he arrived at his apartment an hour later did he begin to understand what had happened. Stefan barely slept that night. He lay in bed, stared at the ceiling, and replayed the evening over and over again. Where had he made the mistake? With the decision to go with Nam to the second bar, with the drinks he had not ordered, with the signature he had given without reading. The next morning, he went to a cafe frequented by many Germans. He needed someone to talk to, someone who understood. He sat down at a table, ordered a coffee, and looked around. At a nearby table sat an older man, perhaps in his early 60s, who looked familiar to him. They had seen each other a few times before, greeted each other briefly, nothing more. Stefan spoke to him. This man introduced himself as Bernd and listened attentively as Stefan told his story. There was no pity in his eyes, more understanding, perhaps even recognition. When Stefan finished, Bernd nodded slowly. That is a classic trick, Byrne said. The bar switch trick, as some call it. It always works the same way. A woman approaches a man, gains his trust, suggests moving to another bar. In the new bar, the rules are then changed without the man noticing. New prices, new players, new control. The lady drinks, Byrne explained, were the heart of the trick. In normal bars, cost between 200 and 400 baht. But in certain bars, the trap bars, as Byrne called them, they cost 800 or more. And no one tells the customer beforehand. They let him sign without explaining what for. The women work as a team, Byrne continued. One lures the man in, another increases the pressure, a third speeds up the pace. They keep him busy, distracted, confused. They order without asking, let him sign without explaining. And in the end, the man is sitting there with a bill that blows up his budget. The worst thing, Byrne said, was that it was legal, technically speaking. The man had signed, had agreed, had consumed. The bar had slips, receipts, had everything documented. Going to the police brought nothing. They would only shrug and say he should have been more careful. Stefan listened and felt shame and anger rising inside him. Shame because he had been so naive. Anger because he had been exploited, legally and efficiently. He asked Byrne whether it had happened to him too. Byrne laughed bitterly. It happens to everyone at least once, he said. Only question is how much you lose. Byrne told him about other men he knew. One had lost 50,000 baht, another 70,000. Some paid out of fear, some out of politeness, some because they simply wanted the situation to end. The bars knew that and exploited it. They played with uncertainty, with isolation, with fear of violence or trouble. Stefan asked what could be done about it. Byrne shrugged. Be careful, he said. Never go with a woman to a second bar. Never sign anything without understanding what it is for. Never accept more drinks than you ordered yourself. And above all, never believe you are too smart to fall into the trap. That last remark hit Stefan hard. He had believed exactly that he had the situation under control, that he could judge people, that something like that would not happen to him. But he had been wrong, and now he was sitting here 1,000 euros poorer with a lesson he had never wanted to learn. The following days were the hardest, not because of the money, although that hurt. 1,000 euros was a lot for one evening. But Stefan had enough savings to cope with it. What really tormented him was the feeling of having been used. The humiliation, the shame, the anger at himself. He thought of Nam, of her smile, of the way she had looked at him. Had any of it been real? Or had it all been acting, a perfectly staged performance to lure him into the trap? He would never know. Nam had disappeared, untraceable, a ghost in the night. Stefan began speaking with other men who had had similar experiences. It was astonishing how many there were. At German regulars' tables, in internet forums, everywhere men exchanged their stories. Some had lost less, some more. But the pattern was always the same. Gain trust, change location, increase the pace, present the bill. One man said he had tried not to pay. The situation had escalated, he said. The bouncer had demanded his credit card. Another man had taken his phone as a deposit. In the end, he paid out of fear that it could get worse. The police, whom he later contacted, had only laughed. It was a civil dispute, they said, not a crime. Another man told of a similar situation. but with a different ending. He had refused to pay, stood up, and left. The men at the door had not stopped him, but they had photographed his face. Since then, he said, he felt watched whenever he walked through Pattaya. Maybe it was paranoia, maybe not. Stefan understood that there was no perfect solution. You could pay and swallow the humiliation, or you could refuse and risk the consequences. In both cases, you lost. That was the genius of this system. It was built so that the man always lost, no matter what he did. He began changing his habits. He rarely went to bars, and when he did, only to ones he knew. He no longer accepted invitations, no longer followed women into other places, signed nothing without reading it. He became more careful, more suspicious, almost paranoid. It was not a pleasant way to live, but it was safer. Some of his acquaintances laughed at him. "You are exaggerating," they said. "Not every woman is a scammer. Not every bar is a trap." Stefan nodded and agreed. Of course they were right, but he also knew that you could not recognize which woman, which bar was safe until it was too late, and he was not willing to take that risk again. The stories spread through the German community. Stefan became a kind of warning example, a story older men told their friends. "Be careful," they said. "That happened to Stefan, and he is not a fool. If it can happen to him, it can happen to anyone." Stefan hated being passed around as a warning, but he also understood that his stories might help others avoid the same mistake. And if his pain, his humiliation served any purpose, then perhaps it was that. Months later, when the pain had subsided somewhat, Stefan began to analyze the situation systematically. He was a tradesman, used to breaking down problems, understanding them, finding solutions. He applied the same method to what had happened to him. The first mistake, he realized, had been the change of location. In the first bar, he had control. He knew the prices, understood the rules, could leave at any time. But when he went with Nam to the second bar, he had given up that control. The new bar was her territory, not his. The rules were different, the prices unknown, the people all part of a system he did not understand. The second mistake had been the reinforcement. One woman alone was manageable, but when Ploy joined, then the third woman, the situation became overwhelming. 3 voices, 3 smiles, 3 pairs of hands distracting him. He had had no chance to think clearly, to calculate, to control the situation. That had been intentional, he realized. The women had put him into a state in which he was only reacting, no longer acting. The third mistake had been the pace. The drinks came quickly, too quickly. No time to think, to hesitate, to say no, only further, further, further. The pace made it impossible to keep the sum in his head, to calculate the costs, to stop in time. Only when the bill came could Stefan even understand how much he had spent. The fourth mistake had been the signature. He had signed without understanding what for. That had bound him, legally, morally. The signature had been the moment. The trap snapped shut. After that there was no escape, no discussion, no negotiation. He had agreed, so he had to pay. The fifth and perhaps greatest mistake had been his own overestimation of himself. He had believed he could judge people, control situations, protect himself. But he had not understood that he was fighting a system, not individual people. A system that had been perfected over years, that worked every day, that had men like him as its target group. Stefan wrote everything down in a document that he later shared with others, a kind of guide on how to recognize and avoid the trap. He listed the warning signs, the unexpected suggestion to change bars, the sudden arrival of more women, the drinks that came without being ordered, the signature demanded without explanation, the bouncer who suddenly moved closer when the bill came. He shared the document in forums, in groups, in conversations. Some men thanked him and said it had helped them. Others laughed and said they were too smart to fall for it. Stefan did not respond to those comments. He had once thought the same thing, and he had been wrong. 1 year after that evening, Stefan sat in a cafe and thought about everything he had learned. Not only about bars and scams, but about himself, about Thailand, about life as a foreigner in a foreign country. The most important lesson had perhaps been humility. He had believed he understood the world, could judge people, could protect himself, but the truth was more complex. In a country whose language he did not speak, whose culture he did not understand, whose systems were foreign to him, he was more vulnerable than he had thought. Not stupid, not naive, just human. And humans made mistakes. The second lesson was caution without paranoia. It was important to be attentive, to recognize risks, to protect oneself, but it was just as important not to live in fear, not to distrust every person, not to see life through the lens of constant threat. The balance was hard to find, but necessary. The third lesson was acceptance. What had happened had happened. He could not change it, could not get the money back, could not turn back time. He could only accept, learn, and move on. The alternative was to drown in bitterness, and that would only harm himself. Stefan began helping other newcomers. When he met Germans who had just arrived in Pattaya, he told his story not as a warning, but as information. "This is what can happen," he said. "It does not have to happen, but it can. Be careful, be attentive, be smart, but do not forget to live." Some listened, some did not. Some nodded and made the same mistakes anyway. Stefan understood that. Some lessons had to be learned the hard way. He could only offer what he knew. The rest was up to them. He also began to see Thailand with different eyes. Not as a dangerous country full of traps, but as a complex country with light and shadow. There were scammers, yes, but also honest people. There were traps, but also real friendships. There were risks, but also opportunities. The picture was more nuanced than he had initially thought. He visited bars less often, but he did not avoid them completely. He had learned to read the signs, to set boundaries, to say no when necessary. He drank his beer, had conversations, went home. Sometimes a woman invited herself to sit at his table. Stefan was polite but firm. One drink, one conversation, nothing more. And never did he follow anyone into another bar. A few times women tried the old trick. The suggestion to go somewhere else where it was quieter, nicer, better. Stefan smiled and declined. "Thank you," he said, "but I would rather stay here." The women shrugged and looked for another target. There were always new men, new victims, new opportunities. Stefan did not condemn the women. He understood that many of them acted out of desperation, poverty, and lack of alternatives. The system was bigger than they were, bigger than the bars, bigger than individual scammers. It was a system that connected poverty and wealth, loneliness and greed, need and exploitation. A system without simple solutions. What he condemned was the organization, the professionalism, the cold efficiency, the way human weaknesses were exploited, systematically, legally, without consequences. That was what made him uneasy. Not the individual people, but the system that made them possible. 2 years after that evening, Stefan was once again sitting in a cafe and speaking with a young German who had just arrived in Pattaya. The man, in his mid-50s and freshly divorced, enthusiastically told him about the bars, the women, the freedom. Stefan listened and recognized himself in this man. The excitement, the naivety, the belief that he had everything under control. When the man paused, Stefan told his story. Not dramatically, not admonishingly, only factually. "This happened to me," he said. "And it could happen to you too, not because you are stupid, but because the system is built that way, because it works, because it happens somewhere in this city every day." The young man listened, at first skeptical, then attentive. He asked questions, wanted to know details. Stefan answered patiently, explained the mechanisms, the warning signs, the mistakes he'd made. In the end, the man nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said. "I will be careful." Stefan did not know whether the man really would be careful. Perhaps he would make the same mistakes and have to learn the same lesson. But at least Stefan had tried. He had shared his story. He passed on his experience. He could do no more. He thought back to that evening 2 years earlier. To Nam and her smile. To the second bar and the increasing number of drinks. To the bill and the shock. To the long way home and the sleepless nights that followed. It now felt farther away, like something that had happened to someone else, but the lesson remained sharp and clear. "When you take a Thai woman with you into a bar," Bernd had told him, "then you are no longer in your game, but in hers." Stefan often repeated these words to himself and to others. They were simple but true. In the first bar, he had been a customer. In the second, he had been a target. Control, that was the key word. Whoever had control won. And in these situations, the man never had control. He might believe it, feel safe, superior, but it was an illusion. Control lay with the women, with the bar, with the system designed to take money from men like him. Stefan had learned his lesson. Expensive, painful, humiliating, but he had learned it. And now he tried to protect others from learning the same lesson in the same hard way. Some listened, some did not, but that was not his problem. He had done what he could. That evening, as he walked home through the streets of Pattaya, Stefan felt something he had not felt in a long time. Peace. Not happiness, not satisfaction, but peace. He had survived, had learned, had adapted. That was all one could ask for in a foreign country, in a complex system, in a life full of unexpected twists. The bars glowed around him, full of music and laughter and people searching for what they could not find at home. Stefan walked past without stopping. He had learned his lessons, and he did not need to repeat them. Today, 3 years after that evening, Stefan still lives in Pattaya. He has found his routine, his places, his boundaries. He occasionally goes to bars, but only to ones he knows. He drinks his beer, has conversations, goes home, simple, uncomplicated, safe. He tells the story of that evening only rarely now. Not because he is ashamed, but because it has become part of him. Integrated, processed. It no longer defines him, no longer controls him. It is simply something that happened. One experience among many. But when a new German comes to Pattaya, full of enthusiasm and naivety, Stefan sometimes tells his story as a warning, as information, as a friendly service. Some listen, some do not. That is all right. Everyone has to find their own way, learn their own lessons. What Stefan has learned most of all is perhaps this: intelligence does not protect you from mistakes. Experience does not mean invulnerability. In a foreign country, under foreign rules, everyone is vulnerable, not stupid, not naive, just human. The 1,000 euros he lost weigh less heavily than the lesson he learned. He would not want them back if he could, because the price was insight, and the insight was priceless. Before you take a Thai woman with you into a bar, he says today to everyone willing to listen, make sure you take a good look. Not at me, not at my story, but at yourself, your assumptions, your convictions, your illusions of control. Because if you believe you have everything under control, then you are exactly where they want you. And with that, Stefan thinks, while sitting on his balcony and watching the sun set over Pattaya, everything has been said. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story touched you, then subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you do not miss any more documentaries about romance scams and true crime cases. Every subscription helps this channel grow. Until next time.